floor is open. Yes, first Elvira and then Uri, yes.
Yes, so thank you very much for the presentation. I think that, yeah, the book looks very, very interesting. So I just wanted to ask you to say something more about the ineffability of the musical experience. So suppose that you're listening to the fifth Mahler symphony. So is it ineffable because you cannot capture in linguistic terms what you are feeling in the moment in which you are listening to the symphony, or it is something to do with what is represented by the music that you are listening to? Because in the first case, it seems that if you are, for example, Marcel Proust, probably you have the good words to describe the kind of experience that you're having. So in the end, this is not so ineffable. And if it is the second case, at the same time, it seems that you can have some normal experiences in which you are, again, moved by something and you're not sure about what it is exactly, the kind of experience that you are having. So I just wanted to ask you, and so in this second case, it seems that there is no difference between a normal experience and the aesthetic experience. So I just wanted to ask you if you think that this distinction is relevant, and if there are some parts in the book in which you are discussing it.
Yes, so that is something I discuss in my book. Thank you, Elvira, for making that point. I think I should perhaps emphasize again that I think it is very difficult to argue for the existence of something like, so my question for you would be, if what is ineffable are the things that are represented in the music. So my question would be, well, what is that supposed to be, those representations? How do they go over and above the sheer ineffability of the phenomenal experience of listening to music in general? And I think it's very difficult to argue for the existence of such a, I don't know, content or truths or whatever that go over and above the sheer phenomenal experience. Now, you mentioned something that is probably quite appealing to many people who are interested in art or love art, that some people like Marcel Proust, for example, might have a better way of expressing what's going on in musical experiences, or might perhaps succeed in expressing what has been expressed in a Mahler symphony. And so I am sympathetic to the idea. I think this is a nice way of thinking about things, but again, from the point of view of an analytic philosopher, I think it would be very difficult to argue for the point. And that has to do with the fact that we don't really have any clear account of what a semantics would be like for musical experiences, so that we could examine, as it were, whether or not a piece by Marcel Proust constitutes a successful translation of a Mahler symphony, for example. So I think even if I granted the point, then it could only ever remain in a very suggestive sort of metaphorical realm. We could say, oh yeah, what Proust has to say somehow captures what's going on in the symphony, but it could never be something more definite than that. So in that sense, I think when push comes to shove, what really is accounting for the ineffability of musical experiences, it is the fact that they are phenomenal experiences, but what provides the meaningfulness of certain musical experiences, certainly not all, is that it triggers a moment of self-acquaintance. And that is what we experience as so extraordinary. And in fact, I think thinking about it in this way is also interesting, because it can explain why only some musical experiences feel especially meaningful, and also why that kind of musical ineffability is not repeatable. So it might not trigger the same experiences the next time I listen to the piece of music, or it might trigger an ineffable experience in you, but not in me. So I think that's also nicely captured in the way I set up my account. But I do agree with you that there is always this remaining aspect of, isn't there a little bit more that is expressed?
Uri.
Thank you, Silvia. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm wondering what is the distinction between what we cannot express in words because our personal capacity is limited, or because the knowledge of human being is limited, or because it cannot be expressed in words, even if the knowledge of human beings was perfect. I think that it is very relevant to the thought experiment about Mary, since you mentioned that she knows everything that is known in physics, but of course there's something that we cannot know, and physics is developed. And is it possible to ask also a second question?
It's possible if it's short.
Yeah. What is the limit of a critique of poetry versus the limit of critique of prose, given it seems that in poetry, the interpretation of poetry is much more ineffable than of prose? Thank you.
Okay, so I'm probably going to ask you to restate the second question once I've said a little bit about the first question. So the first question, if I understand you correctly, is how do I set up what exactly counts as ineffable, and how do certain other aspects of certain contingencies of human knowledge play into that definition? Is that what you were asking?
Yes, if something is ineffable because I don't know to express it in words, or because it is impossible to express it, or because it is impractical to express it.
Okay, so there's an entire chapter at the beginning of the book entitled Terminology, where I clarify all the different cases of ineffability that are out there, and then I tailor my definition of ineffability accordingly. And so of course, to a certain extent, the way we define ineffability is a purely stipulative matter. We can try and sort of pick out a certain set of cases, and we can choose how exactly we're going to do that. So I'm particularly interested in the kind of ineffability that is not due to certain human contingencies. So for example, that is not caused by, just the mere fact that I happen not to know something, but also the slightly the slightly bigger fact that perhaps physics doesn't have an answer to something yet. And I think the case of Mary that you mentioned is set up in such a way that it is assumed that even in 50 years from now, 100 years from now, when physics has proceeded to a large extent, to a great extent, it would still not be possible to render Mary's phenomenal knowledge in physical terms in such a way that we could communicate her special knowledge. So that's the idea behind it. There is something completely absolute about the ineffability of our own private sensations. So that's what my definition of ineffability gets at, the things that are, in a sense, absolutely ineffable and not only due to a certain contingent fact about the progress of human knowledge. Now, the second question you had was about poetry and prose.
Wait, the difference between the ineffability of the two. You don't have to answer if you don't want to.
Yeah, so I need to know a bit more about what you mean by the ineffability of prose in particular.
I think, do we want to pursue that now? Okay, go ahead.
Leah Goldberg claimed that in poetry review there are things that only poets can understand, since there are things that cannot be translated to critique, etc. We cannot interpret the power of poetry in words. But it seems that if you can say that you don't buy it, but if you buy it, it seems that in prose it is not such a big problem, or that it will the limit of the power of critique is much lower, and it is more the ineffability of the meaning of the poetry, or of relatively to prose. Thank you.
Okay, so what I understood from your question is that what you're saying is that poems are more ineffable than novels, for example. Yes.
Some people say. Yes, he's saying that some people say.
Some people say that. And how would I explain that? I suppose one way of approaching the question would be to say, well, this has to do something with the amount of metaphor that is used in a given piece of text. So assuming that a normal prose text uses a lot of literal language and not a lot of metaphor, then it might perhaps be easier to explain why it is easier to translate it into propositional knowledge, into a completely literal translation of what's going on, whereas poetry is often considered as much more metaphorical. Some poetry is even ungrammatical, so it would be difficult to say how exact, or it would be difficult to provide a translation. So to that extent, I would agree with you that perhaps the ineffability of poetry seems even stronger than in prose texts.
Okay, I have a question, and it's this. At the beginning of Kant's third critique, the critique of judgment, he posits a situation in which a physicist learns about the world, and he says, or scientist, and he says there's something that he calls an ideal of completeness, a Vollkommenheit. And he says every physicist operates in the world with a picture of what physics would be like if he knew everything. Mm-hmm. And then he just fills it in. So he draws a line and fills in the circle. But here's the problem. He can fill in the circle, but he can only do it by knowing more things. He can't unknow the unknown. In other words, he cannot take the original facts and know them in their non-knowledge. Now, we assume that there are lots of things exist out there which we don't know, and which we don't know which affect us, like Higgs bosons before they were found out or something like that, and which we don't know and which affect us. And if we know them, we can only know them as of a certain time. So we don't unknow them in their unknowledge. Now, in other words, there's no way we can know it in the position of being unknown. I'll give you another example. Like, say you're Freud, so you find out that there's this unconscious. So now you have the talking cure. You sit down a patient in psychoanalysis for 15 years to talk. And he's supposed to bring up everything out of consciousness that he knows. But that's the point. You see, he can only do it by being in conscious. He can't know the unconscious in its unconscious state. And that, in a way, the unconsciousness of his own unconsciousness has to remain ineffable for him, because he has to make a modal change in order to carry it into knowledge.
So what you're saying is that as soon as we make something explicit, as in the case of the subconscious, we actually change its nature?
That's correct. As soon as you make something explicit, or that you know it, you change its nature. It's no longer the same thing. If I say, I desired to sleep with my mother, or whatever it is, the famous example in Freud, then of course, quote, what does he say? That's therapeutic, because now I'm releasing the frustration I've had by not sleeping with my mother, or something like that. And before I was repressing it. Now, so long as I was busy repressing this emotion, then in a way, you see, I can't know it in its repressed state. Mm-hmm. I can only know it once it's unrepressed. And so the repression is itself always ineffable. It has to stay that way. In other words, so I can talk and make it all obvious, and now I'm cured and everything else. But nothing has happened to the original situation. I cannot get modally in a situation which is outside my own consciousness. It's a way of agreeing with you.
Mm-hmm. So I was going to say, so basically you're giving me more fuel. You're
That's
providing
right.
more examples.
There are many examples,
Yes.
because what I'm saying is that it's not the limitation of language, it's the limitation of any act of consciousness that it cannot be conscious of that of which it is not conscious. And so it cannot be conscious of that which it is not conscious, and this creates a problem. But I see there are other hands.
Just one small remark about that. This is, I think, what Wittgenstein is getting at in the Tractatus, for example, when he says that we can never get at the limits of language by language, because that would mean having to reach beyond the limits of language. So, and by trying to do that, we would actually express something else. Nonsense, in fact.
We'll do that once we've been robotized. Look, there's one question, two questions, three questions, and then we'll let you go home and have dinner. Why don't you start, you go second, and you go third, okay?
Okay. So, thank you for your presentation. Thank you very much. And I have two short questions. The first one, drawing a little bit from the poetry discourse, I was wondering if you, during your research, you encountered some, if you encountered some examples of poetic accounts of ineffability, meaning poets talking about the ineffable experience and what we call the trope of ineffability. So I think about Dante and his excessus mentis, no? So in the Commedia, he just feigns whenever he is not able to say with words what he is encountering in his journey. So I was wondering if you could share with us like the most significant ones, and drawing a little bit from what you were saying, the inherent paradox of ineffability. The moment that you name ineffability, in a way, you're actually betraying its own nature. And the second question was about, I wanted to ask you if you think that there is an ontological difference between the term ineffability and the term unsayability, like something that is unsayable. As an example, the impossibility of pronouncing the name of God in Judaism, as an example. Do you think that these two terms, in a way, ontologically merge together, or do you think that there is a distinction between the two?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Excellent question. Okay, so the first question related to poetic accounts of ineffability, and I must confess that I'm as an analytic philosopher, did not go too deeply into what actual poets have or had to say about ineffability. I have a few references to ineffability, but from poetic or artistic sources, but not very many, and I wouldn't think that that would have changed the way I approach this subject. But perhaps what gets closest to what you were saying is I've done quite some research on Adorno, and Adorno, interestingly, is accepted by many artists as one of the very, very few philosophers who actually managed to say something about the artistic experience and the experience of creating art that gets at what it is really like. So often I've been told, and I have read, artists just frown upon whatever philosophers have to say about the artistic process or the creative process. Whereas what Adorno has to say about it is widely appreciated. And what Adorno has to say about it is that art and philosophy, at least if I understand what he's saying correctly, have the sort of same purpose, or try to achieve the same goal, which is to name the ineffable, which Adorno terms the non-identical. But at the same time, both in philosophy and in art, it is always a futile attempt. At the moment when you try to grasp something, or you just assign a name to a certain ineffable experience, or whatever you want to talk about, you change, this relates back to what you were saying, you change its nature, and thereby it has already slipped away.
That's right.
Yeah, so, so I think that Adorno is probably the most promising source to look for if you want to study poetic ineffability in some more depth. Now,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Regarding your second question about the difference between ineffability and unsayability, again, a very flat-footed answer would be, it depends how you define these two terms. I don't think that there is a sort of prima facie intrinsic meaning those two terms have. You can define them in whichever way you like, and depending on how you do that, they might or might not converge. So yeah.
Over here.
My question is regarding to the moderator point about the ineffability of sub-unconsciousness. Because my inclination would be to say that you are ineffable about something that you are aware of. You know it in some way. So how can you be? How does it go with a concept of ineffability of something that you are not aware of it as a subconscious?
Is that a question for me or for?
I didn't follow it. Could you repeat it again?
You would say that subconscious is an example of ineffability.
Yes.
Is that what it? And well,
it is. I see. Your point is this: that you think that one can be aware of ineffable experiences.
Right.
Okay. Now, my point is this: that I would concede the point, but it's a very fleeting awareness. So I'll give you an example. Like, you don't notice that time is passing by because you're, for evolutionary reasons, you're spatially oriented. So the fact that minutes are vanishing, or that you're vanishing in the fourth dimension, something you don't notice. And very occasionally, like a door closing, you have this notification that time is actually vanishing. You know, the time is actually vanishing right in front of your eyes. And that is a very weird experience. But the minute you name it, or you live past that second, it's already gone. So all you can do is recreate the vanishing of that experience, of that moment of weirdness, of the uncanniness of it, in a perfectly normal discursive situation, like where we're gossiping about something like that. So it becomes just a form of discourse. And I think that you see that what happens is that the conscious awareness of the experience and the discursive recreation of it, there's a huge gap between them. So for one moment, you may see the unconscious. It's like Lewis Williams has this point where shamans, he says, can actually see the canal that attaches the eye to V1. But of course they can't. They can see it for one fleeting millisecond, and then their eye is full of content again. So I think that one has to be very careful with this kind. It's no persistent. You see, knowledge assumes a persistent awareness. If I have prepositional or mathematical knowledge, it means that I have a consciousness in which, I can keep on making secondary and third sentences. So I don't have a consciousness that's vanishing totally every moment. But ineffable experiences demand a vanishing consciousness. That's my answer. Okay. Dr. Weiser, would you pass the microphone to her so that she will be recorded for posterity?
Oh my God, I don't want that. Okay, first of all, thank you so much for your talk, and it was really, really interesting. And I have one question, part of which you already have answered, but I would like to have some more clarification about it, and it's about the criterion of determining what is an meaningful, ineffable experience. Because first I thought that it would be enough for the subject to say, okay, I had a wonderful experience and I cannot tell you about it. And then you say, no, that's not enough, because I can come to this person and tell him, well, you're not capable to articulate your thought properly, and then you don't have a meaningful, ineffable experience. You're not just intelligent enough or something like that. Okay? So if I understand you correctly, so who is the person, or which kind of knowledgeable agent has the power to determine what's a proper ineffable experiences? And in this context, then I want to ask you about the causal role of the music, piece of art, or anything that trigger apparently the ineffable experiences, but does not appear in your definition of the ineffable experience, since it is the self getting acquainted with the self, and then through what, or what is the object through which it, or what is the trigger that got him there. So that's maybe to. But
let's see if I got the question right. Thank you, Sharon, for asking it. So first of all, I would of course never tell somebody that he was actually not having a meaningful experience. What I was just saying in response to Uri's question was that there are certain cases where we can meaningfully call something ineffable, And those cases don't get at something very profound. So, for example, an example that I mentioned in the introduction of my book, and that also Professor Motzkin has mentioned just now, is the Higgs boson. Before it was discovered by physicists, it was an open question whether or not it existed, which means that the truth about the Higgs boson was a truth that was ineffable, you know, because we just didn't know about it yet. Does it exist or does it not exist? So in a trivial sense, that truth was ineffable up to the point when we had the answer to whether or not it exists. And this is a kind of ineffability that I do not consider in the book, and the reason is that it is in principle removable. So it is removable. We have a pretty clear idea of what would have to be the case for us to remove the ineffability.
That's where I disagree with you. It's in principle removable. The Higgs boson can be known, but the unknowable Higgs boson cannot be known.
That's right. Okay, so
Yeah.
if we're talking about two different objects here,
Yes,
then,
you see.
then that's right. But then my question for you would be, can you even formulate a meaningful question about the unknown Higgs boson? Because
If
what
you
are you
assume that
referring
you're
to?
affected by things in your life that you don't have any idea of what they are,
Like the thing in itself.
like the thing in itself, and we are all affected by things all the time that we have zero idea of what they are, and therefore those things are by nature, they're never knowable, and they're ineffable. I'd say that's 99.9% of what goes on.
Okay, well, here's volume 2 for my...
But you want to keep
Yes.
answering your question.
Sorry, and the second part of your question was about what about the causal role? Yeah. So my definition of ineffability is a definition of ineffability only, and not of meaningful ineffability. So whatever constitutes a meaningful ineffable experience is based on very intuitive, motivating examples, but is not part of the definition. So, but regarding your question, why is it in aesthetic or religious contexts that we tend to have those kinds of experiences? I think a sort of intuitive answer would be to say, well, because they present us with extraordinary perceptual environments or constellations, which perhaps encourage us to see the world in a different way, or perhaps trigger different perceptual experiences in general. That's everything I'm going to say about this, because I think there's a lot more to be said for these things, and a lot more that would have to be said by specialists in the fields of aesthetics or philosophy of religion. But I think that is sort of a first indication of where an explanation of that would have to start. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Jonas. Thank you very much, Dr. Solomon. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you very much.
Same time, same station next year.